Hi, I'm Andy Mackey, and I am talking today with a couple who are involved in an intercultural church plant here in Birmingham. Let's go and hear their story.
We were actually overseas for 4 years, and when we came back, we started saying, well, okay, we have a heart for the unreached, a heart for the nations, a heart for people who don't have the opportunity to hear the gospel. Actually, here in the UK, there are people like that as well. And realising, particularly in big cities, no one is meeting those people really. There's very few Christians maybe living in that area. And people don't have the opportunity to hear the gospel. They are still unreached, even though they're in a country full of Christians. And Birmingham seemed, for various reasons, a good place. And as we looked at Birmingham, we came to explore different areas. We settled on the area we now live, which is very multicultural, very diverse, and has many people from nations where they would never get to hear the gospel. We started a kind of community group, life group, which was let's just start chatting and praying and hearing God on where he might be leading us for a church plant in this part of the city. So we ended up with this very mixed international group online where we had maybe about 20 people kind of associated with this group. Not everyone came every week on Zoom, but it meant that we could start kind of seeing actually God is forming a church before we'd even planted a church. And so actually that kind of core of intentional discipleship, meeting up and doing Bible studies and discipleship course type stuff during those meetings really, really helped to build that community before we were meeting on a Sunday at all.
We as Westerners, we've got our own families, we're very insular, very kind of inward looking a lot of the time, whereas these people are coming from cultures where it's very communal. You don't really make choices by yourself, you make decisions together as a community. And so it's kind of a course to kind of help us understand better how to welcome those people in and how to be family for them in the way that they need.
In terms of how we do worship on a Sunday, we try to include the languages obviously that we have amongst us, because people can pray out in their own language, so they're not feeling like, oh, I have to do everything in English during this service. Actually, you will hear people praying in maybe 5 or 6 different languages during the service. And then what we have for the talk is we have a talk, but it always involves discussion. So it might be some discussion at the beginning and at the end, or some throughout. And that discussion will be in small groups.
2 of the most important things that we're trying to incorporate into that is, how are you going to put into practice what you're learning, and who can you share this with? Because those 2 things are pieces of DNA that a church needs to have. We need to be obedient to Jesus and his words. That's what he's told us to be. And we also need to be sharing it. If we're not sharing it, nothing's going to happen. We want to make disciples, so we have to be disciples. So we need to grow as disciples and be disciples who make disciples, who then make disciples who make disciples. That's what we want to see.
What we'd love to see is God moving, and for us to find the people who are already seeking him, to be able to see how the gospel has been planted into their communities. So there was a moment recently, I was leading worship, and this lady just felt, I guess, moved to sing out and pray out. She started, I think, in her own language and just singing and praying, and basically she was crying, and then just like God moved and basically the whole room was crying, and it was like God's spirit just touched all of us, and I was leading worship from like floods of tears. I'm like trying to do the next song, and just really sensing God's presence among us. I think that's really special, really beautiful. Without God moving, nothing will happen. No one will come to faith. This is not an area where people just walk into the church. It's very unlikely they would just walk into the church and say, I want to become a Christian. That's not going to happen. So actually it's got to be God at work in the hearts of people.
A church planting movement doesn't happen unless there's been a prayer movement beforehand. It's part of kind of just joining in with God's work before we actually join in on the ground. Like, there's a big spiritual battle, I think, that is happening before a church can even start, or before people can even start coming to faith.
The unreached people groups of the world are on our doorstep. And so what is the church going to do about that?